Welcome to Yale University, the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery and Abolition, and the Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies. It covers all of our duties. I'm David Blight. I direct the Gilder Lehrman Center. I've done so for almost 20 years. I don't know, this is our 24th, apparently, annual conference. Unique subject. We've never done this before. This is for teachers and about teachers and because of teachers. And yes, I know not every teacher is a great teacher. I had some great ones and a couple. I was a high school teacher myself for 7 years, Flint, Michigan, where I grew up. A lot of you know that, so sorry. I still maintain it's the most important teaching I ever did. I taught kids from, at that point, a thriving industrial automobile city, mostly stable working class. The school I taught at was about half black and half white. You have to watch that, I guess. Welcome not only to our audience here in Luce Hall at Yale, welcome to our hundreds of people online who are live streaming this. Is there anything I should tell the live stream? Oh, the live streaming audience is also welcome to submit questions when we get to Q&A at each session throughout the day and tomorrow. And my colleague, Tom Thurston, will be monitoring those questions and trying to curate them and hand them off to us up here. All I wanted to say about that business of having been a high school teacher is that I'm getting really old, but I still have some memories of every day at the school by 7 a.m., spending every night preparing. Teaching 5 and 6 hours a day, trying to stay one day ahead. Always a question of physical energy and intellectual energy. I have always felt teaching is both of these things. It's knowing your subject, and then it's the personality and passion you have to put into it to get buy-in from the eyes of your students. But I learned a long time ago that if you don't know your subject, they'll figure that out in a hurry, no matter how much passion you have. But without the passion, you also won't keep them. Through the course of the next 2 days, I look forward to many conversations. We've already started those with those of you who are teachers, non-teachers, in between, learners. But I want to start with this to set up our discussion with my two distinguished morning panelists. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America. I know that's the preamble of the Constitution, and you probably went, come on, why read a restaurant placemat to us this morning? But think about it. A more perfect union. Justice. Domestic tranquility. Common defense, the general welfare, and the blessings of liberty. Those are the 6 objects, 6 objectives of the preamble. They're all about education, aren't they? When we educate, especially in fields like the humanities, social sciences, for that matter, the sciences, aren't we aiming at all of these? Aren't we there too? God, the common defense when I was growing up was all about beating the Ruskies to the moon. Common defense. I didn't stay long enough in science classes. Those 6 objectives were one of the things that abolitionists, from especially the 1840s on, but even before, pointed to develop what they called an anti-slavery constitution. They were up against, of course, this general understanding, which is still out there and perhaps still prevalent, that the US Constitution was utterly and hopelessly complicitous with slavery. And yes, it is in a number of ways, from the 3/5 Compromise through several other features, including the basic checks and balances, which had so much to do with compromises with the slave states. But the anti-slavery constitutionalists went first to the preamble and they said, all of these 6 objectives are anti-slavery. I guess the reason I decided to start with this is, well, I've just been writing a 30-page paper on Frederick Douglass and the anti-slavery constitution, so my brain is stranded in this problem. But we may need today something equivalent, maybe, to the anti-slavery constitutionalism in the service of this issue of public schools, in the service of whatever other feature we want to name about this democracy we have, which seems to be in peril. And I would just suggest for debate that there's no more democratic institution that Americans have ever created than the public school. I'm thrilled to teach at Yale University, and I was thrilled to teach at Amherst College. And I started my academic career at a tiny little liberal arts college in Illinois called North Central College, which is also private. I'm not running down private universities. We're happy to be paid by Yale to teach these brilliant kids here and to use these fabulous libraries. But without public schools, I don't have an education. And neither do 80 to 90% of the people in this country involved in any kind of schooling. I went to Big Ten universities. Actually, when the tuition was cheap, it isn't anymore. The public school is the most democratic thing Americans ever invented. It made a middle class. If there's something called an American dream alive, that's where it probably has grown. There is so much else to say. We are here in part because this issue of how race and slavery are taught in the American classroom has been pushed to the front of political agendas, of educational debate, of school boards, of curriculum committees, and in front of you teachers. And we have many teachers here, by the way, and others coming tomorrow when they have a day off, from Florida, from Ogden, Utah, from Chicago, from California, from the Northeast, from the South, to tell their stories of dealing with this issue. But it's been put in front of us in part, let's be honest, because it's a terrific wedge issue, isn't it? Every day we hear almost nothing, it seems at times, except about conspiracy theories. We're living in the midst of disinformation, misinformation, conspiracy theories, but that's nothing new, is it? And the many of us who know something about antebellum America know that antebellum America was awash in conspiracy theories. The two big ones were the slave power conspiracy and the Black Republican conspiracy. And man, did they throw those ideas at each other. And yeah, you can come out on one side of the other. The Democrats said the Republican Party was the Black Republican Party. That was the radical left. That was the coastal elites. That was those fanatical New England abolitionists and that fanatical Abraham Lincoln from the prairie. The slave power conspiracy argued that there was this cadre of pro-slavery interests, not just the slaveholders, but pro-slavery interests that had a stranglehold on the American Constitution, on the American polity, that had made minority rule not only possible, but very deft. And we have a minority rule problem now. Christopher Rufo launched this issue of, we have to say it at least once, critical race theory. It will be said again. But he first published a piece sponsored by, he's a conservative activist. He's first sponsored a piece for the Manhattan Institute. And he argued in that piece, and here I wanna really thank our two student researchers, and you're gonna hear from them in our lunch breakout. It's Abigail Layton and Sarah Street. You may have met Sarah upstairs. She was handing out things. Anyway, they've put together this huge collection of just research. They even plowed into Twitter. Of course, we paid them to do that. To try to uncover what's going on about this. What are people saying? They even read the responses to my tweets about this conference, which were interesting. And at some point a little bit later, Sarah has sent me 3 of her favorites that I'm gonna read to you. But Abigail read all these articles and has sent them to me, and I've been reading them. But Rufo's biggest problem, he said, was that the term political correctness wasn't working anymore. It just wasn't good enough. It wasn't getting the kind of traction that it needed in the culture war. So they needed something else. Needed something new. And he had found it in this theory, he said, about critical race theory, which he said, quote, connotes hostile, academic, divisive, race-obsessed, poisonous, elitist, anti-American views. That's quite a list. But that's not where he stopped. He went on to say, in another article, and on Tucker Carlson, of course, he says, quote, we have successfully frozen their brand, critical race theory, into the public conversation and are steadily driving up negative perceptions. We will eventually turn it toxic, and we put all of our various cultural insanities under that brand category. The goal is to have the public read something crazy in the newspaper and immediately think critical race theory. That's the quiet part out loud. Now, I feel like I need to apologize for even bringing up Rufo, but this is where this particular part of this issue started. It tells us a great deal about our media environment, which Danielle has written about brilliantly, about the power of social media over our brains. And of course, all over conservative media, this was picked up like manna from heaven. Glenn Beck, on whatever program he runs, called the teaching about this poison. And he said, fire the teachers, fire them. Anybody who apparently teaches about divisive subjects or divisive concepts. I don't want to belabor any more of your time, except to say that let's dedicate this conference to the teachers who've been shot in their schools. I don't have a statistic. The statistics are miserable of the children killed in schools, the employees killed in schools, but teachers too have been killed in schools, including just last week, and I'm sure there's been one since, in St. Louis, where that 61-year-old physical education teacher named Jean Kutska, elected to the Missouri Sports Hall of Fame, former national champion in, I think it was lacrosse, A white woman who taught in an almost entirely black school, beloved by her kids as a coach, as a teacher, just gunned down by the latest kid with a rifle. The student who was gunned down there too, the usual, if you look it up, brilliant, charismatic, 16 years old, a dance major, and already planning her professional career in culinary school. Well, let's just remember them. We're always talking about how teachers are heroic, and you get tired of hearing that, don't you? Yeah. Call me heroic. Increase my pay, damn it. Or how about I fly you off once in a while? Go to some conference at Yale, maybe. The great William James, philosopher. He took time out from writing all of his masterpieces, the principles of psychology, the essays on pragmatism, and so much more, the varieties of religious experience. He took time out in 1899 and 1900 to do a whole series of what he called talks to teachers. James could hang in Harvard Yard every day of his life, and no one would ever question him, except to have a stroll with him, as W.B. Du Bois put it. But in his talks to teachers, and there was a whole series of them, you should pull them up and read them, or some portion sometime. He was talking about public school teachers in 1899. If he could express this trust in teachers, why can't we? James said, he said that teachers, quote, need tact in front of their pupils. Tact. Got that right, didn't he? And a good deal of, quote, ingenuity. And above all, he said, knowledge of their subject. Good idea. And he said, the teachers of the country have its future in their hands. Now, that's a cliche, isn't it? You hear that all the time. You have the future in your hands. You'll never forget a good teacher. But it's true. I still remember Mildred Hodges, who taught me U.S. history at Flint Central High School. She was stern. She was unhappy, it seemed, all the time. She never stopped reminding us that she went to Columbia University in New York and studied with Richard Hofstadter. Do you know I studied with Richard Hofstadter? Every week we had to hear that she studied with Hofstadter. But she had methods that I didn't understand at that time, but I did later. She taught us about causation and consequences. That's all she cared about. But man, that's important. And then James ends one of his talks to teachers with a bunch of maxims. One of them is this. He's speaking right to the teachers. He says, don't preach too much to your pupils or abound in good talk in the abstract. Lie in wait, rather, for the practical opportunities. Be prompt to seize those as they pass. And thus, at one operation, get your pupils to think, to feel, and to do. Yeah, you can accomplish any two of those three on a given day. You've won. Get them to think, to feel, and do. Okay. I am thrilled to introduce our two opening panelists. I'm thrilled they said yes when I contacted them. I was slightly surprised, but delighted. Jamelle Bouie has become my favorite columnist in the New York Times. Glad you came. Jamelle is based in Charlottesville, Virginia, and in DC. He was educated at UVA. He also is a commentator on CBS News. Covers all sorts of subjects, as you can as you obviously all know, you read him, for the New York Times. Prior to the Times, he wrote for Slate magazine. And before that, for the Daily Beast, American Prospect, The Nation, and many other outlets. I've recently especially loved his pieces on the Constitution, and we're going to take that up in a minute. But he wrote a really poignant piece on education, well, more than one, but about 2 months ago or 3 months ago, I don't recall now. And when I read that piece, actually, that was back in January or February. Well, I know you don't. I know you write him every week. So, but I said, all right, I'm going to invite him. You know, he won't have time, but he wrote back, and here we are. Jamelle, thank you for coming. Now, Danielle Allen is one of the great scholars of many subjects of our time. She's James Bryant Conant University professor, director of the Lilly Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard University. Her fields are many: philosophy, ethics, public policy, classics. She's run nonprofit organizations. She's, to put it mildly, a democracy advocate, a national voice on everything from pandemic response to how to think about the Declaration of Independence, and indeed has written a book on that, and particularly on how can we think about reforming our democracy, or renovating, as she puts it, our Constitution. We're going to talk about that. And she even took time to run for governor of Massachusetts last year. Obama didn't win anything his first time out either. So, stay tuned. I can still remember standing on the street over here. Danielle and I booked a time to talk, and I was going to run a little fundraiser for her online, and got, 5 of my friends to show up. And we just stood there on the street talking issues and why she was running. And it was, God, I walked away from that just some bouncing, like, yeah, this is the kind of people we wish would run for office and maybe even win. She runs the Democratic Knowledge Project, which you can look up online, housed at the Safra Center at Harvard, and another project called the Democracy Renovation Project. Many books, especially that wonderful book on the Declaration, which perhaps some of you teach. It's called Our Declaration, a reading of the Declaration of Independence in defense of equality. She has a book out on democracy in the time of the coronavirus. She writes a regular or semi-regular column for the Washington Post, a public intellectual of our time, like few others. She also wrote the book "'Cuz, The Life and Times of Michael A., which is the story of her nephew, a tragic story of her nephew, incarcerated for years, later murdered. Anyway, I could say much more about both of these people. I think we should just get to the point here. We're going to have a discussion of this question of education and teaching and race and slavery in the classroom and the Constitution and democracy and whatever else you ask them about. So, Danielle and Jamelle. Oh, I got the middle. I don't expect any fights here. I'll try to pause them. Oh, no. Yeah. All right. There we are. You hear everything in the background? Good. For both of you first, and then we'll dive in. Public schools. Public schools. this vision, this idea. It comes out of the early 19th century. A long evolution, long history. Been pilloried and beaten up over time, but it survives. How do you think about public school? How do we protect them? Reform how we conceive. You're involved with a lot of schools.
It's true. School is my life. And let me just start by saying thank you, David, you as well, but thank you, David, especially for putting us all together for this incredibly important conversation and for the inspiration that you provide. I can remember the first time I read something by David Blight, and my brain shifted. And it's been true ever since. So I love to learn from Professor Blight.
Is that my column on baseball?
So, and I'm especially grateful for the slave narratives they published. That was a different kind of writing. It was making sure that people's voices came to the surface. But so grateful for those texts. So public schools. I went to a public high school and then on to a private elementary school. I ended up in a private elementary school because when I was getting ready for kindergarten, my parents took me in. I guess that was the kind of standard practice. And they gave me a test, and then the principal sat my parents down and said, "She's never going to be any good at math." She had lots of good teachers, and then there's sometimes you do that, sometimes skip the ones that are not so great. So for that reason, my parents put me in a private school, elementary school, but they always believed in public schools and wanted to make sure I had a public school education. So I always knew from kindergarten that I would go to public high school. And my kids are in public schools in Cambridge, Mass. And public schools actually go back even further than the 19th century. Massachusetts in the colonial period. The most important thing the colony did was require every town government to set up a common school and to devote public resources to that. So David is absolutely right when he says it's the most democratic institution. We would not have even our imperfect constitutional democracy if it were not for that original commitment of common purpose, common investment in shared schooling. It's that fundamental. So I'll just start there.
Okay. Jamelle, thoughts on public school?
Sure. First, I need to echo Danielle and say, you're saying, why did surely busy ways are going to come here? Listen, if I check my email box, it's like David Blythe's inviting me to come talk about education. It's like, yeah, of course. So thank you for inviting me. Thank you for being here. I'm also a public school kid. I'm a military brat too. Not too many people know about that. Both my parents served 20 plus years in the Navy. I grew up more or less on military bases, which means I attended public schools for elementary and middle and high school. Went to public pools, public daycares. Like I lived a little Scandinavian life. And so I have not just a great deal of affection for public schools, but I really do think of them as integral to inculcating the kind of values we want in citizens and democracy. I credit being in public schools, relatively diverse public schools, with sort of a kind of tolerance, a kind of broad understanding and willingness to learn from other different kinds of people, an appreciation of what shared space can do, how shared space, whether it's a school, whether it's a pool, whether it's a recreation center or a library, what those things can do to build community and to encourage people to relate to each other as equals. So my wife is a public school teacher, as a matter of fact. So I'm not just like, what's her name? Shout her out. Protectives. We have strict rules about that. Okay. And I can refer to the existence of my wife.
My life.
But that's all to say that it's not just I think they're valuable, but I do think they're something they are a feature of American society that might be the most important thing to protect and cultivate and ensure the survival of.
Okay, how do you, Jamelle, you go first this time. How do you assess the fact that we're here talking about race and slavery, teaching in the classroom, an issue that has exploded, it seems, in barely 2 years? I mean, it's always been an issue. In fact, there are precursors to this way back. But how do you assess this right now? How do we get there? Is this pure politics? What's real about it?
That's
All of this stuff every day.
That's a great and an interesting question, because it is a little bit strange in that you expect these sorts of conversations to have taken place during the Obama years. You expected this kind of controversy to happen when we had a Black president. But I think that in a funny way, the presence of a Black president, they kind of put it a little cynically, share illusion of racial progress that we can maintain during much of those years. I'll actually keep a lid on it in terms of like public and political debate. Sure, people were talking about it and writing and everything, but it didn't kind of come out into the open the way it has in the last couple of years. But the rise of Donald Trump, his election to the presidency, his tenor of politics, the kinds of coalitions that formed around him, events like the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, in the various sort of controversies over Confederate monuments. I think all of these things, they spurred efforts to sort of understand, what is going on. Like why is it that this political candidate who really trafficked into really ugly racism, how is it that he could have such appeal to so many Americans? Why do we have big statues of Robert E. Lee all over the place? Why, where do these white supremacist groups come from? And so I think just in trying to answer those questions, you begin to get this much more public investigation and public debate over slavery and race in American history. And I think we have this conversation about noting how the New York Times' 1619 project, by virtue of being so widely read and so widely debated, and so considered so controversial, really brought this into the open. And then all of a sudden, it does become very political and specifically very partisan, right? It becomes a way for opponents of Democrats or liberals or whomever to prosecute a case against what they perceive as being an attack on American patriotism. Like in a lot of ways, the political conversation about slavery and race is not really about the history at all. It's about sort of an alternative or competing notions of what the American nation is, who it's for, and who it includes.
And one quick question in that. You've written that the fact that this is such a salient issue right now, you said, is evidence that the right is losing this debate about what our history is because they become so defensive. Explain that a bit.
Yeah,
Does that feel like they're losing?
I don't want to sound like a Pollyanna or anything. It's the crusade against quote unquote CRT, in addition to creating political careers, has led to some really ugly laws, explicit attempts to suppress speech. Right. So it's not that there aren't worrisome or bad things happening, but I do think, to my eyes, so much of this has to be in terms of a rear guard action. It's sort of the reason, and people like Chris Rufo, conservative activists, will say this. Like when they're being candid, will say this. That the reason you have to bring state action against these things is because, in other words, they've already lost the culture. Right, like the cultural battle in their eyes has already been lost. I think the George Floyd protests in 2020 for the people prosecuting this crusade were basically sort of like an existential shock, because it wasn't just in 2020, it wasn't just Black people in urban centers protesting. a story that I find that was like etched into my mind is that in Virginia, on the Eastern Shore, a lily white town on the Eastern Shore, a bunch of white teenagers organized and marched for George Floyd. And I think that is the thing, that's what they're talking about when you say the cultural steps. And that's what I mean when I say the fighting the river action, that when you're looking at essentially a social reproduction crisis, right? Like people like you are no longer believing the things about the country that you believe. It engenders a lot of panic and a lot of ferocity in response. And that's not to say that the backlash is like gonna fail, like it could very well succeed, but I do think it represents coming from a position of weakness.
Moral panics have always tended to be about fear about the youth. I have a senior thesis student doing fabulous senior essay on the origins of Superman comics. I didn't know anything about this, but man, did that turn into a moral panic by the early 1950s. And it led to the keep offer hearings on comic books and all, and it was all about your opposing views. It's an interesting pattern. Now, how do you assess how in the world you got here with this issue? Long-term, short-term?
No, it's a super important question, and I do think a lot of what Jamelle said is right about the rear guard action, but maybe what I can also do is put some other pieces of information on the table that I think help clarify the landscape. I've been fortunate over the last few years to be part of a big community of people working on bringing new investment into the field of civic learning. We published a roadmap in March 2021 called Educating for American Democracy. It's a huge network, 300 scholars and educators around the country. We worked really hard to build a cross-ideological coalition, in fact, sort of link arms, hold some kind of broad, redefined center space so that we can actually do something together. And we continue to do that work. And as part of that effort, we have recently been trying to understand better what the American public thinks about civic learning. And so two key partners, iCivics, which some of you may know, they produce a lot of civic resources, and an organization called More Perfect, which is working on democracy renovation towards 2026. Together funded a survey. They hired a Republican pollster to do this because they wanted to sort of overweighting on the conservative side. Often if you hire more liberal leaning pollsters, you will get a kind of skewed picture because both sides.
So that's really true.
Both sides, and you get more people from that side, so it affects sort of what you see. But at any rate, and they did survey voters on both parties' side, but we know it was a kind of good, well-weighted survey, and wanted to go discover this extraordinary thing. A super majority of Americans in both parties want civic learning in schools. Both parties, super majority, including among Republicans, want civic learning in schools. And not only that, but a majority of Americans in both parties want, federal investment in civic learning in schools. To have Republicans, the majority of Republicans, practically want federal investment in anything.
In the private of their television.
It's highly unusual. So this is a very significant feature of public opinion. But then, from my point of view, even more importantly, there's a question, I'm not going to get exactly right, but something along the lines of over the last few decades, scholarship has increased our understanding of African American history, and there has been an effort to include more African American history in American schools. Do you think there should be more African American history in American schools? Majority of both parties, yes. It matters how you ask the questions. It matters how you structure the agenda of public conversation. And what the Christopher Rufus story is really about is a rearguard action, trying to structure the agenda of public conversation in a way that sows confusion, exacerbates division for political purposes. And honestly, from my point of view, I'm not convinced the purposes are actually cultural. I think the purpose is literally to hold political power for a party. Yeah, exactly. So in that regard, my kind of core message is don't be distracted. Find the space and time to set the agenda and ask the right questions. And I fundamentally believe that the American people is ready for and committed to a truthful and complete accounting of our history, good and bad, and modes of teaching that support the development of young people as empowered, participating members of our community who also have a sense of owning our community. So that's my message of hope, I guess, with a little bit of data to try to back it up.
Well, thank you for the hope, because well, you're so good at that. Because everywhere I go to give talks now, at the end, there's always a parent, usually, who says, "Fascinating, Professor, but where's the hope?" You must get that all the time. Where's the... I want to transition to discussing the Constitution for both of you. As you know, you've been writing about the Constitution quite poignantly. I think Danielle is your subject in so many ways. In fact, you used in your project, you used your house metaphor. It is renovation. It's a house that's teetering. It's broken here, broken there.
It was never built for everyone. So
It
that's
wasn't built for everyone. It
renovation.
didn't have room for everyone. It's a great house divided has always been useful for our local culture. But that renovation of our Constitution, how are we going to do that? How do you, I mean, how does that need to happen, and then how can it?
Wow, how long did you?
Yeah, I know.
I have an answer for you, but I could literally talk for days and days. And
Well,
days
just
on
take,
that.
part of today.
Oh. I'll do my best to keep myself under control.
Start anywhere you want.
Well, let me actually start where we are first, which is to say educators and civic education. Some of us were talking earlier about how the phrase civic education is a kind of empty phrase. And that's also true. This survey that I mentioned, there's a partner one which was digging into language, and it can confirm nobody has any idea what you're talking about when you say the word civics. So that's a big problem. Maybe I'll start figuring that one out. But it is also the case that young people are disaffected from our democracy. They've got a lot of good reasons. I'll come back to that in a second, but they genuinely are disaffected. Which means, in a sense, the single most impactful, fastest thing we could do would be to reconnect young people to this democracy, to give them the understanding, the skills for working together with others to solve problems, and the motivation to do so. That would do more to change the dynamics of our country's future than anything else. But as I said, they do have good reason for their disaffection. Like, stuff doesn't work kind of comprehensively. You know, Congress doesn't get a lot done. We see a lot of fighting. There's all kinds of toxicity. Actually, I have to say the roads in Connecticut are pretty good. But like driving from Massachusetts to Connecticut, every time I hit the border, thank you. Oh my gosh, so much better. Yeah, our transportation's a mess in Massachusetts. Anyway, that's aside.
We have better roads.
So much better. Like, I know, I could go on a long list of things that you hit the border. And, so nice. But anyway, the point is, and there's, again, you know, there is research on this. If you look around the world, developing democracies, when people put effort into, for example, turning out the vote or encouraging people to participate in a government that's been weak or fragile in various ways, and then if that government continues to be weak and corrupt, you actually increase the cynicism. So it's one thing we can say, let's get young people reconnected, but if you're reconnecting them to something that is broken, that will actually exacerbate the problem. So even at the same time that we are digging in to educate young people, I hate to say it's a both and moment. As people with power, voting power, organizing power, we all have more power than we realize that we have. We actually have to do that renovation work so that the kids have a house worth being in. And so what does that mean? I always like to call people's attention to a report that came out in June 2020 from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences called Our Common Purpose, Reinventing American Democracy in the 21st Century. It's got 31 recommendations in it. I'll just end with one because it is my favorite and it kind of sort of blows people's minds when they start to think about that. Increasing the size of the House of Representatives. Like, what? We don't like it anyway. We want more of that? Yeah, we actually do want more of that. Because if you'll remember, the House was supposed to grow as the population grew. And that was meant to include a principle of elasticity and flexibility in the functioning of the government. Also, a bigger House would mean a more diverse body of representatives. You would get the population that are represented in the House. It would also rebalance the Electoral College because the number of members of Congress goes through the Electoral College. And so it would get us out of the sort of, doom loop we're in with the ever increasing sort of minority rule situation. It would help us turn that crank back and rebalance. So let's increase the size of the House. There's 2 bills being drafted right now in Congress. So, look them up. Blumenthal, maybe that's one of your people, isn't it?
He's our senator.
Yeah, I think one of them may be a Blumenthal bill, if I remember correctly. So check it out, and consider putting your energies into it.
So Madison and Jay and Hamilton's idea that scale of this republic would blunt factions. This at least goes to that point. You increase the number of representation, thereby you diffuse the problem of factions. Is that?
That's a part of it for sure. And I mean, there's other things as well that you would want to do, probably multi-member districts with ranked choice voting. You would want the whole package together. But right now, we actually have a situation where the House is slowly turning into a version of the Senate. And that's the thing to say about it. We do not want 2 Senates. I mean, some people would say we do not want 1 Senate. We certainly don't want 2 Senates.
Well, that's my next question. Do you see any hope of reforming the Senate?
I don't think it's necessary, and we may disagree on this one and worth digging into. I think that there are rebalancing mechanisms that can revivify the principle of popular sovereignty in meaningful and transformative ways. And so that's what I'm focused on. And I still, I'm looking, talk me out of it. I do still appreciate the kind of notion that the Senate, it doesn't turn over in complete form every 2 years, is a sort of stabilizing rudder for the system as a whole, and that there's value in that. So, but convince me.
So, Jamelle, go, because you have argued that the Constitution is itself structurally so undemocratic that that's where this problem begins. If I read you correct.
Yeah, no, that's right. And I'm also a Senate hater.
You kind of point.
Yeah.
Watch out, you're in the middle there.
I'm trying to think where to start. I think that so much about the way the Constitution structures American democracy, the kind of assumption of the first past the post voting in single member districts, the Senate, the Electoral College, equal state representation in the Senate, which is actually probably the more precise issue I have. Equal state representation in the Senate, the Electoral College, as it eventually developed, all these things work to sort of restrain the formation of majorities and then restrain their ability to act. And my view is that on the balance, this has sort of been worse for Americans than it has been better. That the outsized power the Constitution gives to not even all political minorities, because it doesn't. That's the funny thing. It's not all political minorities. It's like certain subsets of the polity. You live in the right kind of environment, you occupy the right kind of space, you all of a sudden have outsized power in the system. And the way that the American political system does that, far from, I think, the assumption that many Americans have that it's part of what protects their liberty, I think it's done far more to, I think the phrase I've used is really enhance the power of like various bullies and bosses to trample over the rights of other people. And so my sort of, when I think about kind of institutional reform, it's all in terms of like, how can within a federal system, which I don't think is ever really going to change, like as much as I do have a whole case against why we shouldn't have states. They're a bad idea.
Federal supremacy is like James Madison.
Yeah, that's yeah. But we're gonna have states, right? We're probably gonna have a Senate. It's sort of one of those things that I think as long as we have a United States, there are gonna be parts of the system that we're just gonna have to have dependency because of the historical legacy, because we were invested in it. But even within that, there's nothing about American style federalism that says that you have to enable minority rule on the state level. There's nothing about American style federalism that says that the Senate has to have these sort of this almost permanent ability to permanently veto anything that comes out of the House. Sure, my parenthetical Senate reform is not so much to get rid of it, but to have like a reverse filibuster in which it takes
filibuster for sure.
It takes a supermajority of senators to kill someone from the House, right? That, like they can still do it, but it really has to be a good reason. They have to be able to get a simple coalition to say whatever's coming out of the House, we're going to kill, or we're going to offer an amendment, and then you can do it, rather than what we have, which is that if you don't assemble a supermajority to pass something, then it's effectively dead. But I think you can have American style federalism, they have strong protections for various political minorities, but also have much more majoritarianism. I think this is necessary because my fear right now is just the way, in concrete terms, it's entirely possible right now for a political party to capture a bunch of state houses in the right states, gerrymander them so it is impossible for the political opposition to actually win control of the states. Pretty much already happened in Wisconsin.
I think you're describing a reality and not
a hypothetical person. There's nothing in the Constitution, nothing in the rule book that says that these states couldn't then, to reinforce the minority rule, create something like state level electoral colleges for state offices, right? So that even if you can assemble a statewide majority in Wisconsin to win the governorship, you can design a system constitutionally that says you need to get the right kind of votes in the right kind of places. And then once you have enough of those states, you can just, if you wanted to, say, well, we're giving our electors to the Republican candidate for president. And congratulations, we now have a presidency. Like you can very easily engineer a permanent capture of the national state through state level anti-democratic measures. So in my view, it's reforming the American system to basically prevent that, which in my mind means more majoritarianism throughout the system. It's paramount. I'll say another thing, because I think even before you can begin suggesting to people institutional changes, you have to like change people's mindsets and relationship to the Constitution. And I think that the overwhelming relationship many Americans have to the Constitution is somewhere it's either indifference born of I just don't care, or indifference born of, well, it's impossible to change, and the way things are, the way they're meant to be, or in the great wisdom of the founding fathers, this is, et cetera. And one of the things I've been trying to do in my column is basically try to present the framers as practical politicians, and some of them like not even that great ones to begin with.
You're not great ones.
Charles Pinckney. I have a list. I'm not going to gross them out like that and not say that I have a list. But really emphasizing these are practical politicians, like reifying the compromises they made. And this is a distinction I really try to make, that it's not, again, you can have American style federalism, but there's nothing about American style federalism that requires that we keep the compromises these people made to bring it into fruition in their age. And I think trying to impressing on the public that the compromises, the union may be eternal, but the compromises to make the union are up for grabs, I think is very important.
That's where the civics education comes in, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I spent a lot of time talking to people about the difference between good and bad compromises. And I think to the point that Jamelle is making, I think that's another one of our challenges, is we are so clear about the badness of the slavery compromises that we actually don't really have a category of good compromise. And that makes it much harder than to own and take responsibility for new forms of compromise and finding what in the present we need to do. So 2 more points maybe there. The first is just to say, that true originalism, in my view, is about adaptation. I mean, that is exactly the charge the Declaration of Independence gives us. We know, I am always going around quoting the second sentence of the Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. They're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. But among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, driving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and institute new government, laying its foundation on such principle and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. That is exactly what
Can you do that? Very impressive.
Sorry.
Bravo.
I'm only making that and doing that to say that's exactly right. That was just my way of backing you up, which is like, there it is right there. It is the right of the people to alter or to abolish and to institute, right? New government laying its foundation on such principle. That's the question of what are our values? What goes on that list of rights, among which those are examples on the list of rights. It's not a complete list. Right there, it's an invitation to inquiry. Among which, what? There's more? There's more? What else? How do I know? How do I pick? How do I have an argument about that? It's all right there, like that little among which is the portal into civic education. Literally, that's all you need. Among which? Oh my.
The Declaration is an open door.
It's an open door. And then it makes the open door explicit. It's the right of the people to alter and organize the powers as to them, to us. Shall see most likely all we can do is put a wager on our hypothesis to affect or bring about our safety and happiness. That safety and happiness is the general welfare of the Constitution. It's exactly the same phrase. It's kind of a couple of different phrases they used interchangeably, sometimes safety and happiness, sometimes general welfare. They're all translations of the Ciceronian phrase, suprema Exesto salus populi, the way around, salus populi, suprema exesto, let the health and well-being of the people, salus populi, be the supreme law. Salus populi, that is what the general welfare is, it's what safety and happiness is. That motto, the Latin one, it's still chiseled above the State House, I think in Missouri. It's in a number of different sort of founding state documents. But the point is, it's in itself open-ended. It's a commitment to our shared well-being that we then have a responsibility to figure out how to execute on. And that's where we need to do the work of reorganizing powers and finding out what the compromises are that we need. Good versus bad compromises. Can I say one more thing?
Sure.
So.
I wish I had taken classics with you. Go ahead.
I always, for good versus bad compromises, I come back again and again to the 2 compromises that are visible in the Declaration. One is about enslavement. The phrase life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness was an anti-enslavement phrase. It didn't say property. Property already was linked to a defense of enslavement at that point in time. So life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness was opening up the vista beyond the defense of enslavement. Of course, the cutting out of the passage condemning the slave trade was the pro-slavery moment of compromise. That's the bad compromise. The good compromise is the language around religion in the Declaration, which is open-ended. It's not doctrinal, it's not theological, it's any particular faith can fit in, but so too could those who didn't believe. Hence the phrase laws of nature and nature's God. That's a belt and suspenders story. Maybe you don't believe in a God. Well, we still think there's a sort of source of morality. We're going to call it laws of nature. Maybe there's a different way of thinking about it. But the point is, the deists, the atheists, they too could assign value to. They could commit to the Declaration of Independence. So what makes the difference between these 2 bad and the good compromise? I think it's pretty straightforward. That compromise, they didn't bother to ask everybody affected by it. That easy. The religion compromise captured the religious perspectives of basically everybody. That was part of the polity being created, whether in a position of domination or not. Whereas in the enslavement compromise, it did not capture the perspective and position of everybody. So yes, we do still need to compromise, and that can be hard and painful, but that's the point of democracy, because basically somebody's always got to lose a little bit in every decision. That's what authoritarianism means. You don't want the same people to be losing all the time for sure. You want to circulate that experience, but the way you get there is with a culture, and practices of compromise. But we need new ones for our time and our conditions. We don't have to use the.
I'm so glad you brought up religion, because I've always felt like founders screwed up a lot by separating church and state. They, in part, gave us 240 years, because without that, we don't survive. And it's easy to forget that natural rights can be utterly secular or deeply religious. You can get it from Thomas Paine or the epistles of Paul. But they're still natural. They're still natural.
So they're a moral grounding. So there's that kind of commitment to some deep moral view about human dignity. And that's why I think the book comes.
God, I want this debate to go on, but I know I got to turn it over to the audience. I came with a whole bunch of data points here that I was going to ask you both about, if you're lucky. So we got a mic we're going to pass around. Anyway.
I can help with that.
Yeah.
I have a couple of questions from the broad
You do have from
online
the
audience.
online audience? Okay, you want to start with one of those?
Okay, sure. This is from Tina Roberts, who's a teacher in Connecticut. She said, I had my first student tell me the other day that he doesn't believe in slavery, not the reason for the Civil War, not that Europeans did anything wrong, but that it didn't happen at all. My school is attempting to be anti-racist. It's primarily white. I'm one of the very few BIPOC teachers there. What can I or we do to overcome this tide of history denialism?
I've never heard of someone saying it didn't happen. That's new. And you hear it wasn't that bad, and people were treated well, but there was no slavery. That's new.
But the denialism is on steroids, I guess, is what we, and that's a problem. Go ahead.
No, it's because you always have to ask, like, what emotional needs does denialism fill in, right? Sure, it's like with conspiracy theories. The problem, conspiracy theories aren't about the facts. They aren't about, this is why I personally think so much of the conversation around misinformation is a bit sort of misfocused. That it's more about what emotional and psychological need is the thing filling. And it seems like one thing slavery denialism might be doing is fulfilling the emotional and psychological need to believe that the country in which you live is like basically decent, right? That's sort of like you basically belong to a decent kind of national community. And if acknowledging the existence of slavery would toss out of the conflict, you're going to just reject that altogether. And so, if that's the emotional need being fulfilled, then how do you address that emotional need while at the same time introducing the correct facts? I don't actually have an answer to that, but I think that if you approach the problem that way, you might be able to come closer to an answer, right? Like maybe the answer looks like, first of all, sort of showing the student, or taking them to a site where enslaved people were, like physical evidence, but then also, a lesson about the abolition movement, like a lesson about sort of the people in the country who fought very hard to end slavery, and try to begin to introduce the idea that you can still be proud about the good things about your country while acknowledging the terrible things. You don't have to give up, you don't necessarily have to give up this emotional need you have in order to, engage with political life and then history and all those things. But I think it's in terms of sort of like trying to figure out where to begin to answer that. You have to look at like why, not even why, how do they get these bad facts? Like what are they trying to fill in their soul that would make that attractive to the lead?
So I'm gonna just add a little bit, and I see there are lots of questions, so I'll be brief. Just first of all, to also acknowledge what a hard experience that is as a teacher and educator to be confronted with a challenge of that kind. And then to share that on our website, Democratic Knowledge Project, Harvard, we have a grade 5 curriculum about enslavement and abolition. And we're really proud of it, also because the portion about, well, actually all of it is all primary source based. So as we teach about enslavement, we are using texts written by people who experienced enslavement themselves to show students what the experience was and then to engage students in that. And there's also some resources connected to the curriculum about building lessons around enslavement and how to build lessons so that what you're doing is always kind of first surfacing where learners are starting. And I think that's actually one of the most important things for teaching about enslavement effectively, even if they're starting in a place that is seemingly incomprehensible. There are ways to move from that starting point to kind of co-processing to shared understanding.
Let's go right here for the next quick. You got the mic? Oh, the mic's over here. Okay. Our friend from Florida, yes. But we'll go to the Greenwich teachers next.
Dr. Allen, whoa, that's live. One of the facts that you used is that I found optimistic is that most Democrats and Republicans support federal investment in public school curriculum, and that is optimistic.
Civic learning.
Civic learning. Yet you also said that it's clear from your work that the term civics is not clearly understood. Yeah. Has your research found that those who have anti-democratic beliefs actually want to weaponize the federal apparatus to teach their version of historical truth and the denialism that Jamelle actually just confronted? So in other words, using the federal apparatus to teach undemocratic, truth-based histories is one of the concerns that we have in Florida, in places like Texas and Virginia. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that question. And again, I mean, it's an incredibly fraught time, and there's so much polarization and conflict all around us, including in this space. And I think, yes, lots of folks are trying to use state tools to drive their agendas. But I think it's worth actually kind of doing a deep dive. You should share from Florida, which I don't know as well. I've been doing some work looking at Texas recently to try to understand what's happening. And it is really interesting because at the same time that we're watching the sort of bills that are restraining teaching of divisive concepts and the like, Florida is also a place that recently passed an ethnic studies requirement for African American studies. Also, I believe, for Hispanic or Latin, Latino studies, and where there's a debate underway about potentially adding, for example, Asian American studies. So the point is that there's a debate. It's not a sort of one-sided enterprise, and I think the debate is really more a question about how we achieve an education that is connected to all the histories in our country, rather than whether we're going to do that. And at the core of the debate about the how is are these questions about pride and shame at the end of the day. And how does teaching connect to experiences of pride and shame? So I think you're right, sort of name the kind of emotionality there. And I think this is actually hard. It's a hard subject to enter into. For exactly the reasons Jamelle was pointing to, that it can be very, very easy to kind of develop pride if you obscure the truth. And it's much harder to develop a sense of belonging and connection if you have a fully honest picture. It's not impossible by any stretch of the imagination. I think we probably all sit here with a sense of commitment to our constitutional democracy, commitment to our community and things like that. And we also have a clear-eyed view about historical realities. So we know it is possible to achieve that sense of connection to a kind of tradition, even in a context of clear-eyed honesty. But I think that is actually the issue we're fighting about, how to handle those hard issues of pride and shame.
Yeah, and I appreciate the fact that the irrational or emotional part of this, because for teachers, you face that every day. Let's go here for the next question.
Yeah, thank you. This is incredible. Sanford Levinson wrote a book about constitutional faith, that our civic religion, in absence of having religion, is a belief in the Constitution. A couple of things that struck me as you were going through this: a UConn professor did the math on redistricting and said we have to have a House of well over 900 members to achieve equal districts, which is problematic of itself. You've got the Supreme Court basically adopting a position, probably that independent legislative theory would allow state houses to.
That's the North Carolina case they're about
Yeah,
to decide.
and they're going to go that way. But more problematic than those two is that the only unamendable part of the Constitution is equal representation in the Senate. So in terms of staying hopeful about compromise, so many scholars from Larry Sabato to Levinson to a bunch of others, they can never get the other side of the academy to sit down with them, are calling for constitutional conventions or even running mock constitutional conventions. Are we on the road of having to answer the question of compromise being blowing up what we have, using an Article 5 trigger to address this? Because I want to stay hopeful, and at the same time, I read and I freak out. So I see this panel as
Read Bouie and freak out.
yeah. Well, but I mean, I'm trying to keep hope and keep the kids motivated. But when they get engaged, like you said, and then they see Roe v. Wade crushed or whatever the issue is of the day, so is it a constitutional convention, or what do you think we need?
Well, I mean, I really appreciate your asking, and even more, I appreciate your trying to answer that question yourself and engage your students in answering it, because that is where I think the path begins, as each is actually trying to answer that question. My own personal answer is that it's incumbent on each of us to ensure that our state has a healthy democracy. Even Massachusetts, people think we're healthy, we're not. We've got the lowest voting registration rate for African Americans in the country. No southern state, it's Massachusetts, okay? There's a lot more that can be said about that. And I believe that we won't get health in our federal government until we have health in all our state governments. And so I'm putting my energies into trying to do democracy renovation in Massachusetts, basically, and encouraging everybody else to look at their state government and try to do that. Because you can, through your state government, do things like get to those multi-member districts, get to ranked choice voting, all kinds of things to change the dynamics of our politics. And I think if we can change the dynamics there, we have a chance of changing them.
Thank you.
Can I just say real quick? I've read plenty of people talking about sort of the need for new constitutional convention. I like the idea of mock constitutional conventions. Like I think getting into the practice of thinking about the constitutional system is something that can be changed. It's just like going to be part of any journey to any kind of political reform, even on the state level, right? Like I just think people have this sense of our political systems being kind of immutable, right? They just are. It doesn't help that when you look at the past 50 years of American history, there really hasn't been big constitutional change, right? There haven't been new amendments, there haven't been new states. There's been a level of stasis in the entire political system that has encouraged the idea that this is just, we hit 50 states and we hit 26 amendments, 25 amendments, and we're good. We're done. That's the end of history. History ended, and that's where we are. But getting students, getting the larger public to think about this in terms of, no, it's actually ongoing, and the questions are at the end unresolved. And each new generation of Americans needs to confront and resolve those questions for themselves, I think is very important. And so even an exercise, like having a mock, like I would love to run a classroom exercise where it's just sort of like, today it's May 17, and you need to write a new constitution. And you can use the one we have as sort of like your baseline. So like, let's go for it. I think that's a great exercise in getting students, or even just members of the public. I bet you could get members of the general public to do a kind of thing, as a practice.
I've got some undergrads here, I think, let's do a mock.
You should, you 100%. Can I add one more thing on that? Because I think this is really important. So I want to endorse that 100%, but I also want to give us a frame for thinking about what does it take to be ready to have an actual constitutional convention. Okay, now let's please think about what actually
They had a
happened.
revolution.
They had a revolution, but before they even had the revolution, they had states writing constitution.
That's right.
Their states, by July 4th, 1776, there was already 4 or 5 states that had written constitutions. And then they tried at the national level, and they got the Articles of Confederation, which we all know how that went, right? That was experiment 1, and then they struggled along with that thing for a number of years, total dysfunction, before they got the Constitution. So, they had lots of experimentation happening. They had some successes and some failures at the state level, so they had comparative cases. You read the Federalist Papers, and their comparative cases are coming, a little bit from Switzerland, Poland, whatever, some ancient history, but really what they're learning from is all of those state efforts. That's what taught them what the range of possibility was. And because they've been doing all that experimentation, you know what else they had by then? A culture of compromise. Do we have a culture of compromise? We do not. We are not ready for a constitutional convention, but we should be for sure practicing. We should be for sure doing those deliberations, and I believe that's why the state work is so important, because that is where we will relearn the ability to create a constitution for free self-government among free and equal citizens in 21st century conditions.
You both invited for the Yale student-sponsored mock convention next April,
There you go.
and Juliana and Katie, you're gonna co-organize it? Good.
You gotta have the right conditions too, so, there can be no air conditioning. It's the middle of the summer, and you can only drink hard cider.
There you go. And you also have to figure out who's gonna be, your kind of figure spending a lot of long hours, after hours, going around twisting arms.
Yeah.
Because that's the other thing you need in that mix.
And you need a person keeping one hell of a diary, even if that get published for 40 years in the Virginia magazine. Tom, you got one more from our vast online audience?
From Lois McMillan.
Oh, Lois from Oregon. A lot of us know Lois.
And
She's a super teacher in Oregon.
She asked the both of you, you've been talking about federalism, the political environment. What should the Department of Education on the federal level be focused on, in your opinion? How does that trickle down to a rural school district like Lois is? Is there a genuine divide between rural and urban school systems?
So thank you, first of all, for bringing that question to us and for asking us all to think about all the contexts in the country, and the rural-urban context is so important. We saw it in so many ways. In the pandemic, the fact that broadband wasn't necessarily available in rural contexts to ongoing differences of experience and opportunity for young people. It's really, I think, important to call out another piece of federal legislation currently under consideration called the Civic Secures Democracy Act. And that's also in Connecticut, that's in the House, because that's Rosa DeLauro, actually, and.
Congresswoman Rosa.
Rosa DeLauro joining with Tom Cole of Oklahoma, so it's a very significant bipartisan effort, and then Chris Coons, Delaware, and Conant in Texas. And it's structured to direct resources through states to districts. So this is actually not a question, not an answer about the U.S. Department of Ed. It's an answer to say that there's a really important piece of legislation out there that would really actually direct resources, especially to educator professional development. And it's structured precisely so that it would flow all the way through to districts, rural as well as urban. So I would really encourage everybody to take a look at that.
I just had a fist bump with Rosa at Gilder in Nica's Market the other day. Learning lots of sausages and it was so cool. All right, one more real quickly. This has to be quick, I'm sorry. Coffee awaits. Quick one.
Try to be quick. Thank you so much. I'm struck, I think, by talking about the idea of states' rights the way we started with kind of this rearguard action of the minority that you're focusing on the states there. There have been lots of times in our history where the left has only had the rearguard action of the minority, you know, whether it's same-sex marriage or starting the Republican Party in the 1850s. So my question, I think, is just states' rights are a problem until they're your last hope, and then they're your last hope. And so just kind of you could think about that a little bit. The utility of states' rights, even if right now they seem like a frustrating impediment.
When suffrage started there?
Yeah, exactly.
As much as I hate states' rights, but go ahead.
I think that it's possible to overstate the extent to which states have been used for those ends. So there's no open end, like there's nothing in the Constitution, there's nothing in the rule book. I use the phrase something in the rule book because I like movie Airbud, and so there's nothing in the rule book that says, oh, I can't play basketball. There's nothing in the rule book that says states can't have an expansive vision of what citizenship is, right? Nothing that says that states can't guarantee education, can't guarantee housing, can't guarantee a broad set of political and civic rights, but they rarely do. It's rarely that we see states take that role. Yes, states have been places where there have been democratic experimentation that have expanded to the national level, but that's sort of not, that's not typically the pattern. Typically the patterns like national majorities are developed that then are able to capture national power and move forward. I think that and sort of my explanation for this is actually a very Madisonian one. That is sort of by being just smaller republics, right? Like states are more vulnerable to capture by entrenched interests, by people representing kind of received hierarchies and that sort of thing. And so it typically happens. Like it's not typically the case that statewide government is captured by progressives, by whomever. And even when it happens so rarely that when it does, it like sticks out, right? Like Wisconsin has this reputation for like progressive government, but it's sort of like 2 decades, beginning of the 20th century. And after that, it reverted to normal.
Robert LaFall is long gone.
And so I guess my and to go on to something I read about a lot, I think the example of Reconstruction is a really good instance of states just being vulnerable in a way that national power isn't. And so my suggestion would be it's not like a categorical rule, like it's not always states are bad, but like on the balance, what has actually worked to secure Americans' rights is federal power exercised democratically, right? Like enlarging the sphere of who can participate, enlarging the sphere of political equality, and then the majorities assembled under those conditions tend to actually use the federal government like for good most of the time rather than ill, as opposed to states, which are so vulnerable to capture. And I think that looking forward, on balance, Americans would be better off if national majorities were easier to form and were more representative. I think the expanding the House thing is like really key. I think part of the picture here is designing a more representative political system that brings in more people and offers more opportunities for the expression of a diverse range of political views. But I'm very much like a 1780s circa Madison on this. That like the states You gotta do that caveat, because then, like, you know, 1790 mass is different, and it's all that.
So I'm James Wilson. So
Danielle,
we
what?
found, exactly, so this is our deepest disagreement.
Yeah.
I have a very different picture of states and their relationship to federalism. I would concur that it took national power to break the power of the segregationist South. That's simply a truth. And it is absolutely the case that national power is fundamental to a healthy constitutional democracy on the scale that we're talking about. But I also think that states are necessary and critical, and that their health is necessary and critical to the picture. So I don't think it's an either or, I think it's a both and. And so just a couple things here, I'll try not to go on too long. So for starters, it is worth saying out loud that nearly every state in the country has a constitutional right to education, actually. That is actually where social rights get protected, is at the state level. There's a great book by Michael Rebell on this subject, and Michael is currently litigating cases around the country to try to address the issues of educational funding based on those state constitutional rights. Part of the reason we think states don't protect rights is because we haven't used the constitutional apparatus that exists in our state constitutions, but it's there and it is available for use. Now, the really important thing, though, is to see that there's really three different models for thinking about the place of states. And states' rights is one model. States' rights is a model that has been taught mainly by folks on the right that roughly, takes the view, let states do whatever they well please, right? That is not even what the role for states was at the period of the Constitution, right? That's the Articles of Confederation version of states, okay, is what states' rights is. Then you have the sort of what I think of as the kind of post-civil rights era, more from the left side, which is more or less, I think, what Jamelle just articulated. States screwed up primarily. We need national power to correct that. What I see, the argument that I see, this is actually Hamilton, I suppose, honestly, as well as Wilson, and a little more so than Madison. You look at Federalist Papers, and what they're arguing for there is a need for harmonization of purpose across jurisdictions. You can't harmonize purpose across jurisdictions without national power. National power has to be the anchor. But the goal is to harmonize across jurisdictions. And that is partly about understanding which things are best handled at the national level: domestic tranquility, common defense, general welfare. Which things at the state level? They thought education, they thought health, they thought some other things. These things, too, were choices of the moment for the conditions of the 18th century. They also need to be revisited. So we need healthy states. We need healthy democracies in every single state to support healthy democracy at the federal level. And a part of that work is actually about revisiting which things belong at the level of national power, which things belong at the level of state power. That's not permanent either.
There's a great book out, if you have, not in the title, by David Pepper, about the power and significance of state legislature.
Laboratories of autocracy.
The laboratories of autocracy. But he's from Ohio. He's worried about that.
We are seeing that too. We are seeing laboratories of autocracy, but that's why we also got to do the work of making sure that these laboratories are.
All right, I got to cut this off because we've already. No, it's not your fault. I mean, where have you heard a debate about the Constitution quite as poignant as this recently? Huh? I'll leave you with two statistics. University of Virginia poll. Jamille's alma mater. Found that 52% of Trump voters and 41% of Biden voters, I don't know how they asked the question, agreed that America is so fractured that they would favor some form of, quote, secession of blue from red states. Now, you ask people, if you ask that the wrong way, yeah, what are you going to get? I don't know, but there's something a little troubling in that. The other statistic is, and teachers solve these. Our 50-50 Senate in the last election, 56.5% voted for Democrats, electorally, nationally. 44.5% voted for Republicans. That's a 50-50 minority stranglehold. Now, that leaves you with 2 negative statistics. I'm sorry about that. In the face of all the hope that Danielle gave us, but I had to get those in. Please thank our special guest. That was amazing. Coffee is served upstairs. We're going to gather right back here in about 10 minutes for the second session. Please have a coffee on us, and please come right back down. The next session is about educational history and